Salvage Yard 49B holds millions of dead ships floating in the silent vacuum. A lone engineer gambled his life savings on a charred derelict to escape corporate debt. He expected rusted conduits and faulty reactors. Instead, buried beneath layers of radiation shielding, a fallen empire's greatest secret awaited awakening. The outer rim was never meant for the faint of heart, nor was it meant for those with empty pockets. Out here, past the orbit of Neptune, the United Nations Astromining Coalition had long since given up on maintaining law and order, leaving the void to scavengers, corporate claim jumpers, and desperate men. Caleb Wright fell squarely into the last category. Caleb floated in the cramped cockpit of his tow ship, a heavily modified Boeing orbital tug that had seen better decades. Outside his reinforced viewport lay the graveyard, a swirling vortex of decommissioned freighters, shattered military cruisers, and unidentified alien debris that humanity had dragged back from the edges of the Orion Cygnus arm. Since Earth made first contact 20 years ago, humans had quickly realized they were not the strongest, fastest, or most advanced species in the galaxy, but they possessed one unique trait that the wider cosmos lacked: an absolute stubborn refusal to let anything go to waste. Humanity had become the galactic garbage men, the premier salvagers of the stars. Caleb's bank account was running on fumes. He owed SpaceX Interstellar nearly 100,000 credits for a faulty warp drive lease, and the collection agents were no longer sending polite automated emails. He needed a massive score, and he needed it today. His comms console crackled to life, spitting static into the dimly lit cabin. "Right, you copy?" It was Gregory Miller, the ruthless foreman of Yard 49B. "I hear you, Greg," Caleb replied, wiping a streak of grease from his forehead. "Tell me you've got something that isn't just a hollowed-out titanium shell this time." "I got a Class 4 anomaly," Gregory's voice filtered through the heavy interference. "Unknown origin. Deep space recovery brought it in yesterday. Hull is scorched to hell and back. Scanners can't penetrate the outer plating, which means it's either a solid brick of lead, or it's shielded with something high-tier. The court boys won't touch it because it doesn't match any known registry, and they don't want to waste the man-hour cutting it open." "Price?" Caleb asked, his pulse quickening. 40,000 as is. It was a staggering sum, exactly the last of Caleb's savings. If the ship was empty, he was completely bankrupt. But if it held even a single intact Amoint energy core, he could pay off his debt and buy his own private moon in the Alpha Centauri system. "Send the coordinates," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the hammering in his chest. An hour later, Caleb's tug locked its magnetic grapples onto Hull 7 Alpha. Gregory wasn't exaggerating. The ship was a mess. It was roughly the size of a modern human destroyer, but its design was radically different. Instead of the blocky utilitarian angles of human spacecraft, this vessel was composed of sweeping organic curves, resembling a massive metallic manta ray. The entire hull was blackened, scarred by plasma burns and kinetic impacts that hinted at a violent end. Caleb towed the silent behemoth back to his private leased hangar, an old hollowed-out asteroid fitted with atmospheric containment fields. Once the derelict was secured and the hangar pressurized, Caleb donned his battered SpaceX EVA suit and grabbed his gear: a high-yield Makita plasma cutter, a heavy-duty Prior, and a diagnostic tablet cobbled together from black-market DARPA components. Walking across the hall was like traversing a charred landscape. Caleb found the main airlock, or what he assumed was the airlock, halfway down the port side. The control panel was a fused lump of slag. "All right, let's see what you're made of," Caleb muttered. He fired up the plasma cutter. For the next 6 hours, it was a grueling battle of human stubbornness against alien metallurgy. The whole armor dispersed the heat of his cutter with frustrating efficiency. Caleb had to jury-rig a feedback loop into his cutter, dangerously overloading the battery just to achieve the necessary temperature. Sweat stung his eyes, and his muscles screamed in protest. But finally, the heavy locking mechanism gave way with a structural groan. Caleb kicked the bulkhead door inward. It fell with a heavy echoing clang into the dark corridor beyond. He unclipped a heavy tungsten flashlight from his belt and stepped inside. The interior was freezing, the air stale and tasting of ozone. The architecture was breathtaking, even in its ruined state. The walls were lined with a silvery metal that seemed to absorb his flashlight's beam, etched with intricate flowing geometric patterns. He moved deeper into the ship, passing through what looked like a crew deck. Desiccated remnants of alien flora sat in shattered hydroponic bays. Whatever had happened to the ship, it had happened a very long time ago. As he approached the central core, his DARPA scanner began to chime frantically. "Energy spike," Caleb whispered, staring at the screen. "Wait, that's not just residual radiation. Something is drawing power." He followed the signal down a narrow descending corridor that led to a reinforced vault. Unlike the rest of the ship, this door was pristine, untouched by the fire and violence that had consumed the outer decks. At the center of the door was a biometric scanner pulsating with a faint rhythmic azure light. Caleb approached the console. He didn't have alien DNA, but human engineering had long ago learned that physics was universal. He pried off the pristine control panel with his crowbar, revealing a complex web of crystalline neural fibers. "Fancy," Caleb grunted. He reached into his toolkit, pulled out a thick copper grounding wire and a portable Caterpillar industrial battery. He clamped the leads directly onto the central crystalline node. "Let's see how your delicate neural pathways handle 3,000 volts of raw, unrefined direct current." He flipped the switch on the battery. A violent shower of sparks erupted from the panel. The alien systems shrieked, a high-pitched digital scream, as the brute force electrical surge completely overwhelmed the sophisticated security protocols. The heavy vault door hissed, the ancient pressure seals breaking, and slowly slid open. Caleb stepped into the chamber and froze. The room was illuminated by a soft, ethereal blue glow emanating from a single massive cylindrical pod in the center of the room. It wasn't an engine core, it was a stasis chamber, and there was someone inside. Caleb approached the pod slowly, his boots clicking against the pristine deck plating. He wiped a layer of frost from the reinforced glass of the chamber. Inside floated a woman, or at least a being that looked remarkably like a human woman. She was clad in a sleek white environmental suit accented with gold trim. Her hair was silver, floating like a halo in the suspension fluid, and her skin was incredibly pale. Subtle differences marked her as alien. Her cheekbones were slightly too high, the geometry of her facial structure impossibly perfect, and a faint, almost imperceptible pattern of luminescent scales dusted the edges of her jawline. Caleb's scanner went wild, heart rate steady, brain activity in deep theta wave sleep. "She's alive." He took a step back, running a hand through his messy hair. By interstellar salvage law, specifically the Geneva Centauri Accords, discovering a live sentient being meant the salvage claim was instantly voided. The ship would be seized by the United Nations authorities, and Caleb would be handed a meager finder fee, nowhere near enough to pay off his debts. If he reported her, he was ruined. If he didn't report her, he was committing a Class A felony. While Caleb debated his impending arrest, the pod began to chime. The brute force electrical surge he had used on the door had apparently triggered an emergency power cycle in the room's main breakers. The azure light inside the pod shifted to a harsh blinking amber. "Warning." A synthetic voice echoed through the chamber in a language Caleb didn't understand, but the flashing red icons on the console were universally clear. The suspension fluid was draining. The stasis field was collapsing. "Damn it," Caleb swore. He dropped his toolkit and rushed to the pod. The heavy glass shield retracted upward with a mechanical hiss, releasing a wave of freezing vapor that instantly crystallized in the air. The woman collapsed forward. Caleb caught her before she hit the metal deck. She was incredibly heavy. Her bone density had to be at least twice that of a normal human. He gently lowered her to the floor, propping her up against the base of the pod. She gasped, a violent, desperate inhalation, and her eyes snapped open. Her irises were a striking luminescent violet. For a moment, she stared blankly at the ceiling, her chest heaving as her lungs processed natural air for the first time in an unknown number of centuries. Then, her gaze snapped to Caleb. Before he could react, she moved with terrifying speed. Her hand shot out, grabbing Caleb by the collar of his heavy EVA suit, and shoved him backward. Despite her weakened state, the sheer physical force threw Caleb off his feet, sending him crashing into a nearby terminal. She stood up, swaying slightly, and spoke in a sharp, melodic, and highly commanding tone. The words meant nothing to Caleb. Caleb groaned, rubbing his ribs as he stood up. "Look, lady, I don't want any trouble. I just bought this ship." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small rectangular device, a United Nations diplomatic translation matrix. He tapped it against his throat, letting the microneedles interface with his vocal cords, and tossed a secondary earpiece toward her. It clattered at her feet. She stared at the device, then at Caleb, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. Cautiously, she picked it up and placed it against her ear. "Can you understand me now?" Caleb asked, his voice passing through the translator, emitting a series of synthesized harmonic tones that matched her language. The woman straightened her posture, an air of absolute unyielding authority radiating from her despite being covered in stasis fluid. "I am Seraphina, first heir to the Valyrian ascendancy, commander of the Starfleet Aegis, and rightful ruler of the core worlds. You will kneel before me, scavenger, and explain why my royal dreadnought is powered down." Caleb stared at her for a long moment. He looked at her regal posture, then down at his own oil-stained boots, and then around the blackened, ruined walls of the vault. He didn't kneel. Instead, he reached into his tool bag, pulled out a crinkled foil-wrapped protein bar, and tossed it to her. She caught it out of pure reflex, looking at the cheap human food as if he had just handed her a live grenade. "Eat that. You're going to need your strength," Caleb said bluntly. "And I hate to break it to you, Your Highness, but the Valyrian ascendancy isn't a thing anymore. I read the Galactic history databanks when I bought my towing license. The Ascendi collapsed over 400 years ago, and your royal dreadnought is currently parked in a human scrapyard because I bought it for 40,000 credits." Seraphina froze. The violet glow in her eyes dimmed, replaced by a flicker of raw, unadulterated shock. 400. No, that is impossible. The Kalan Syndicate, the ambush at the Orion Gate. "I don't know anything about a syndicate," Caleb said, leaning against the doorway. "I know that I bought this hull as scrap, which means technically by human salvage law, I own this ship." "You own nothing," Seraphina snapped, her shot quickly morphing into imperial rage. She stepped forward, pointing a perfectly manicured yet dangerously sharp finger at him. "This vessel is the vanguard of truth. It is protected by genetic locks, tied exclusively to my bloodline. You could not even activate the life support without my firster." The lights in the vault suddenly flickered, and a low rhythmic hum resonated through the deck plating. "Actually," Caleb interrupted, tapping his Caterpillar battery connected to the wall, "I hotwired the life support about 20 minutes ago. Your genetic locks are heavily lorked software. Human tech is analog. I literally just jammed a copper wire into your breaker box and bypassed the mainframe. Turns out your Grand Empire didn't account for someone using a crowbar on the fuse panel." Seraphina stared at the crude human battery, then at the thick cables duct-taped to the elegant crystalline panels of her ship. A look of profound horror crossed her face. You defiled the sacred architecture with tape. Hey, if it works, it works." Caleb shrugged. Before Seraphina could deliver another reprimand, Caleb's personal comms unit on his wrist began to blare a high-pitched klaxon. Caleb glanced at the screen, his face instantly draining of color. "What is that noise?" Seraphina demanded. "That," Caleb said, his voice dropping an octave, "is a proximity alarm. My hangar's external sensors just picked up a massive slip-space rupture right outside my perimeter." Seraphina's expression hardened. "The awakening of my stasis pod would have triggered a subspace distress beacon. If the ascendancy fell, then the ones who betrayed us are still listening." Caleb pulled up the sensor feed on his wrist. A massive, jagged warship had materialized outside his asteroid hangar. It wasn't human. It bore the dark, metallic, angular designs of the Dominion, the ruthless coalition of alien oligarchs who currently held an iron grip over the sector's trade routes. And leading this local fleet was Commander Victor, a brutal enforcer known for vaporizing independent salvagers who got too close to Dominion secrets. "Well," Caleb muttered, grabbing his plasma cutter, "looks like you have visitors, and they don't look like a rescue party." The hangar trembled as the Dominion warship locked its tractor beams onto Caleb's hollowed-out asteroid. Dust and loose debris rained down from the rock ceiling above the vanguard of truth. "They're initiating a forced docking procedure," Caleb said, quickly typing commands into his wrist console to lock down his perimeter doors. "They'll breach the main airlock in less than 3 minutes." Seraphina rushed to the central console of the stasis vault, her fingers dancing across the crystalline interface. "I must activate the ship's defensive matrix. We are heavily outgunned, but the Vanguard's plasma shielding can withstand a Dominion bombardment." The console flashed an angry crimson. Seraphina slammed her fist against the panel. "What's wrong?" Caleb asked, packing his heavy tools into his bag. "The main reactor is entirely dead," Seraphina said, her voice tight with panic. The power you supplied from your crude box is barely enough to run life support. The weapons arrays, the shields, the propulsion. They require the primary zero-point core to be initialized, and the core is locked. Then unlock it. I cannot, Serafina shouted back. The betrayal of my empire was an inside job. The Syndicate corrupted our central intelligence network. They instituted a fleet-wide lockout protocol. Even with my royal biometric signature, the system requires an overriding command code from the Emperor himself to cycle the primary core. Without it, the ship is nothing more than a tomb. Caleb stared at her. You're telling me your highly advanced, hyper-lethal alien warship is rendered completely useless because of digital DRM. I do not know what DRM is, but yes, the software will not permit the hardware to function. Serafina looked down in despair. It is over. Victor's shock troops will breach the hangar, execute you, and take me to be paraded before the Syndicate. A massive explosion rocked the facility. Caleb's console flashed red. Airlock breached. They're inside the asteroid, Caleb stated grimly. He could already hear the heavy metallic thud of Dominion synthetic shock troops marching through the exterior corridors. Caleb looked at the pristine alien console, then at his bag of heavy battered human tools. A wild, desperate grin slowly spread across his face. Princess, Caleb said, unspooling a massive coil of industrial-grade conductive cabling. Let me teach you a little something about human engineering. We don't ask the software for permission. What are you doing? Serafina asked, watching in bewilderment, as Caleb ran toward the maintenance hatch beneath the console and ripped it off its hinges with his pry bar. Where is the physical connection between the plasma batteries and the port-side cannons? Caleb yelled from inside the floor. Great. It is routed through the central subprocessor on Deck 2, which is heavily encrypted. I don't care about the processor, Caleb interrupted, poking his head out, grease already smeared across his cheek. Where are the actual physical tubes that carry the explosive energy to the guns? Serafina blinked. The primary plasma conduits run directly beneath this floor plating, heading straight to the exterior turrets, but you cannot channel power to them without the computer opening the magnetic valves. Watch me, Caleb grunted. He dropped back into the hole. Sparks began to fly as the heavy Makita cutter sliced through the alien alloy. Outside the ship, heavy laser fire began tearing into Caleb's makeshift barricades. Through the hangar's internal security feed, Caleb saw a squad of 10 Dominion synthetics, towering heavily armored droids carrying rotary plasma rifles. Behind them strode Commander Victor himself. Victor was a towering alien of the Vesk race clad in heavy black armor, a brutal plasma sword resting on his hip. Right. Victor's synthesized voice boomed over the hangar's public address system. You are harboring a fugitive of the Dominion. Surrender the Valerian anomaly and I will grant you a swift death. Resist and I will boil you alive inside your EVA suit. Inside the ship, Caleb was sweating profusely. He had cut straight through the hardened shielding of the ship's plasma conduits. Inside ran thick, glowing veins of raw energy, dormant, but highly volatile. Princess, Caleb shouted, hauling the heavy Caterpillar industrial battery over to the exposed hole. When I tell you, I need you to manually spin the rotary crank on the side of this battery as fast as you can. It's an emergency manual alternator. I am royalty. I do not operate manual labor devices, Serafina protested, though she stepped closer. Do it or we both die, Caleb snapped. He grabbed the heavy copper jumper cables. The ship's computer is keeping the valve shut because it's following a corrupted code. But a valve is just a magnetic lock. If I pump enough raw, unregulated voltage directly into the conduit's external casing, the electromagnet will overload and force the valve open. The residual power in the cannon's capacitors should be enough for one shot. Serafina looked at the crude human setup, entirely horrified by the blatant disregard for safety protocols. If you miscalculate the voltage, you will not just open the valve, you will detonate the entire port-side hull. Then it's a good thing I'm bad at math. Caleb grinned. Footsteps clanked against the outer hull of the derelict. The Dominion synthetics were attaching breaching charges to the very door Caleb had opened. Now, Princess, spin it, Caleb roared. Serafina dropped to her knees, grabbed the heavy iron crank on the human battery, and began to turn it with all the enhanced superhuman strength her alien physiology possessed. The generator winded, screaming as it produced a massive electrical charge. Caleb slammed the jumper cables directly onto the exposed alien plasma conduit. The reaction was instantaneous. A blinding flash of blue electricity arched across the room. The ship's internal lights blew out, showering them in sparks. Deep within the bulkhead, a massive mechanical groan echoed as the digital locks fought against the brute force analog surge. Crack. The magnetic valves blew open. The software screamed in protest, throwing hundreds of error codes onto the shattered screens. But the hardware had no choice. The physical pathway to the guns was open. Targeting, Caleb yelled, pulling out a heavily modified tablet. He had hooked a commercial Wi-Fi dongle into the ship's exterior sensor array, running an open-source trajectory algorithm. "You cannot fire a dreadnought's cannon with a handheld device," Serafina yelled over the deafening whine of the charging plasma banks. "It's just point and click, Your Highness." Outside, Victor watched as the breaching charges on the derelict's hull armed. "Detonate," he ordered coldly, before the synthetics could trigger the explosives. The dead hull of the alien dreadnought suddenly flared to life. The massive portside plasma cannon, which had sat dormant for 4 centuries, violently swiveled downward, aiming directly at Victor's boarding party. Victor's eyes widened. Impossible. The central core is offline. Inside, Caleb hit the enter key on his cracked tablet. The ship bucked violently. A beam of concentrated blinding white plasma erupted from the cannon. It didn't just hit the boarding party. It vaporized them instantly, melting right through the asteroid floor, the hangar's containment fields, and continuing out into the void of space. When the smoke cleared, Commander Victor and his 10 elite shock troops were simply gone, replaced by a glowing crater of molten slag. Caleb coughed, waving the heavy smoke out of his face. He looked down at the melted jumper cables, then over to Serafina, who was staring at the destruction on the security feed, in absolute awe. "Human engineering," Princess Caleb wheezed, wiping grease from his eyes. "Sometimes the best way to untie a knot is just to cut the damn rope." Serafina slowly stood up, looking at Caleb, not as a primitive scavenger, but as something entirely unpredictable. "The Dominion ship outside is still operational," she said, her voice dropping to a serious whisper. "They have realized their commander is dead. They are charging their main batteries. We have no shields, and you just destroyed our only power conduit to the guns." Caleb looked at the flashing red alarms on his wrist console. "Yeah, I guess it's time for us to leave." "Leave in what?" Caleb smirked. "In my tow ship, it's got a SpaceX hyperdrive bolted to a reinforced chassis. It's ugly, but it's fast." "And the Vanguard?" Serafina asked, looking around her ruined ancestral ship. "I've got the title in my pocket," Caleb said, grabbing his bag. "We'll come back for it. But right now, if you want to rebuild your empire, you're going to have to learn how to fly blue collar." The hollowed-out asteroid was already beginning to collapse. The Dominion cruiser, hovering just outside the hangar's failing containment fields, opened fire with its secondary battery. Blistering bolts of crimson plasma slammed into the rock, sending massive shockwaves through the deck plates of the Vanguard of Truth. "Move now," Caleb roared, shoving his heavy toolkit into Serafina's arms before sprinting toward the primary airlock. Serafina stumbled under the weight of the canvas bag. She was a royal heir, genetically engineered for grace and tactical superiority. Yet, she found herself hauling greasy human tools while running for her life. The indignity was overshadowed only by the collapsing roof of the hangar. Giant chunks of stone and steel plummeted around them, crushing the remains of Victor's synthetic squad into a fine powder. They burst out of the derelict's airlock and scrambled across the docking umbilical, connecting the dead dreadnought to Caleb's ship. The tow ship, heavily modified and completely devoid of any aesthetic appeal, was a battered Boeing orbital hauler. Its hull was a patchwork of mismatched titanium plates welded together with brutal utilitarianism. Caleb hit the manual release on the airlock door, shoving Serafina inside before diving in after her. The heavy steel door clamped shut just as a stray plasma bolt annihilated the umbilical they had been standing on seconds prior. "Strap in," Caleb yelled, vaulting into the pilot seat. Serafina stepped into the cockpit and stared in profound bewilderment. There were no sleek, crystalline interfaces. There were no neural link halos or biometric synchronizers. The console was a chaotic mess of physical toggle switches, analog dials, and glowing LED buttons. Wires hung haphazardly from the ceiling, held together by strips of black adhesive tape. A bobblehead of a vintage Earth canine sat on the dashboard, vibrating violently as the ship's engines idled. "What is this monstrosity?" Serafina demanded, reluctantly strapping herself into the co-pilot seat with a frayed nylon harness. "This vessel belongs in a museum of antiquity, not a combat zone. This monstrosity has twin Lockheed Martin fusion thrusters and a heavily modified SpaceX slip drive," Caleb shot back, his hands flying across the console, flipping switches with practiced frantic precision. "She's got it where it counts. Hold on." Caleb punched the main throttle. The Boeing haulers screamed in protest, the structural frame groaning as the massive engines ignited. They tore out of the collapsing asteroid just as the Dominion cruiser's main battery fired. A beam of concentrated energy eviscerated the hangar, reducing Caleb's leased asteroid to a cloud of superheated dust and gravel. The tow ship burst into the open vacuum of Yard 49B, a sprawling chaotic vortex of millions of dead ships. Behind them, the Dominion cruiser, a massive, jagged dagger of black metal, pivoted with terrifying agility, its engines flaring as it gave chase. "They are pursuing," Serafina stated, her eyes fixed on the rear-facing sensor monitor, which consisted of a cracked LCD screen duct-taped to the bulkhead. "Their weapon systems are recharging. We cannot outrun a Dominion interceptor in open space. Their propulsion drives operate on zero-baned quantum displacement. Good thing we aren't in open space," Caleb grunted. He jerked the heavy flight yoke to the left, sending the hauler diving into a dense cluster of destroyed freighters. Caleb piloted the ship like a madman. He threaded the needle between the shattered halves of a commercial luxury liner, the proximity alarms blaring a continuous, deafening screech. He banked hard, scraping the paint off the hull as they squeezed through a narrow gap between two massive rusted engine blocks. Serafina gripped her armrests, her flawless composure finally cracking. "You are flying entirely on manual reflexes. The margin for error is non-existent. Where is your navigational AI?" "I ripped it out," Caleb shouted, pulling a heavy lever that diverted power to the rear deflectors. "The IBM logic core kept telling me my maneuvers were mathematically suicidal. It was annoying." The Dominion cruiser followed them into the debris field, but its size and reliance on automated flight paths became an immediate liability. Its computer systems desperately tried to calculate safe trajectories through the swirling garbage, forcing the massive warship to break and weave clumsily. "They are falling behind," Serafina noted, a hint of grudging respect coloring her tone. "Your reckless utilization of environmental hazards is effective." "Don't celebrate yet," Caleb muttered, his eyes glued to the radar. "We need to clear the gravitational pull of this junk field before the SpaceX drive can spool up for a jump. We need 30 seconds of clear space." They burst out of the dense wreckage, the stars of the outer rim stretching out before them. Caleb reached for the hyperdrive ignition, a massive red button encased in a scratched plastic housing. Before his finger could press it, a violent jolt rocked the ship. The cockpit lights flickered and died, replaced by the ominous red glow of emergency backup power. The hauler's forward momentum ceased instantly, suspended in the void as a sickly green light bathed the cockpit. "Tractor beam," Serafina said grimly. "They have locked onto our mass signature. We are being pulled backward." On the rear monitor, the Dominion cruiser emerged from the debris field, resembling a mechanical predator reeling in its prey. "Their boarding parties will not make the same mistake twice," Serafina said, her voice turning cold. "They will vent this ship's atmosphere and take me from your frozen corpse." Caleb didn't reply. He was already out of his seat, tearing a maintenance panel off the floor beneath the console. "Their tractor beam operates on a localized gravity tether, right? It artificially increases the gravitational constant around our hull," Serafina explained rapidly. "But you cannot break it. We do not have the thrust." "We don't need thrust. We need a distraction." Caleb grinned, pulling out a heavy cylindrical object from the smuggling compartment beneath the floorboards. It was an industrial-grade fusion cell, the kind used to power heavy mining lasers, stamped with the logo of a defunct asteroid mining corporation. "What are you doing with that?" Serafina asked. "The Dominion ship is pulling everything in our immediate vicinity," Caleb said, wiring a small remote detonator directly into the fusion cell's safety regulator. "If I drop this out the rear airlock, their tractor beam will pull it straight into their forward deflector shields. A fusion cell explosion will merely scorch their shields," Serafina argued. "I don't want to break their shields," Caleb said, running to the rear of the cockpit. "I want to blind their sensors. This thing is packed with unfiltered plasma. When it pops, it's going to create a localized electromagnetic pulse and a thermal bloom so bright their computers will think a small sun just went supernova. He slammed the cell into the waste disposal chute and slammed the purge button. The heavy fusion cell ejected into space, instantly caught in the invisible grip of the green tractor beam. It flew rapidly toward the Dominion cruiser. "Cover your eyes," Caleb yelled, leaping back into the pilot's seat and hovering his hand over the hyperdrive button. 3 seconds later, the void outside flashed with a blinding, terrifying white light. The detonation didn't shatter the cruiser, but it completely overwhelmed the ship's intricate sensory arrays. The green tractor beam flickered, sputtered, and died as the Dominion computer forcefully rebooted its targeting systems to compensate for the massive thermal spike. The sudden release of tension threw Caleb back into his seat. He smashed the red button. The SpaceX slip drive winded, a deep, bone-rattling vibration that shook the very rivets of the hull. The stars outside stretched into long, brilliant streaks of starlight, and with a violent concussive boom, the battered human tow ship tore a hole in space-time, vanishing into the slip space corridor. The chaotic roar of the engines faded into a smooth, rhythmic hum. The cockpit was bathed in the swirling ethereal blues and purples of slip space. Caleb slumped back in his chair, exhaling a long, shuddering breath. He rubbed his face, smearing grease across his nose, and let out a dry chuckle. Serafina sat in the co-pilot seat, her violet eyes wide, staring out into the dimensional tunnel. For the first time since she had awakened from a 4-century slumber, the absolute certainty of her royal upbringing had been shattered. She turned to look at Caleb. He was currently wrapping a fresh roll of duct tape around a sparking conduit near his knee. "Your technology," Serafina began, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. "It is profoundly inefficient. It is loud. It is dangerous. It relies on combustion, brute force, and kinetic energy." "Yeah, well, we get by," Caleb said, ripping the tape with his teeth. "The Valyrian ascendancy," she continued, looking down at her perfectly manicured hands, possessed technology that was flawless. "Our ships were governed by quantum logic algorithms. Our weapons were mathematically precise. We eradicated human error from our society." She paused, a shadow of profound grief crossing her features. "And that is exactly how we were destroyed." Caleb stopped taping and looked up. "What do you mean?" "The Kalan Syndicate did not defeat us in open combat," Serafina explained. "They infiltrated our central intelligence network, because all our systems were perfectly integrated. Our dreadnoughts, our planetary defenses, our supply chains. The Syndicate only needed to introduce a single recursive logic virus. The virus triggered a synchronized shutdown across the entire empire. The flawless system locked us out of our own weapons. When the Syndicate fleets arrived, we could not fire a single shot. We were slaughtered by our own perfection." She looked directly into Caleb's eyes. "I fled in the vanguard. I entered stasis to await rescue, hoping the Emperor would break the code. He never did. But today, I watched you bypass a level 9 biometric genetic lock with a piece of copper wire and a chemical battery. I watched you destroy an elite Dominion boarding party using mechanical valves and brute force. Your systems are not integrated, they are chaotic. They are entirely separate from one another." "That's called analog engineering, Princess," Caleb said, leaning back. "You can't hack a physical lever. You can't put a virus into a steel crowbar. Humanity learned a long time ago that if you put all your eggs in one digital basket, eventually someone is going to drop it. We like things we can hit with a wrench when they stop working." Serafina slowly nodded, a spark of realization and dangerous ambition igniting in her violet eyes. "Caleb Wright," she said, testing the human name on her tongue. "The Vanguard of Truth is merely a flagship. It holds the navigational coordinates and the physical command keys to the Imperial Ghost Fleet. A massive armada of dreadnoughts hidden in a dark nebula on the edge of the galaxy, kept in perpetual stasis." Caleb's jaw went slack. "An entire fleet, thousands of ships," Serafina confirmed. "Undiscovered by the Syndicate, untouched by the Dominion, but they suffer from the same digital lockout as my flagship. If I return to them, I cannot wake them up. The software will not permit it." She leaned forward, her regal authority returning, but this time it was tempered with a deep newfound respect. "I need an engineer. I need someone who does not ask the computer for permission. I need someone who will take a plasma cutter to the royal circuitry and force the magnetic valves open. I need a human." Caleb stared at her. His mind raced. He had woken up this morning desperate to scrounge 40,000 credits to pay off a corporate debt. Now he was being asked to hotwire an entire galactic armada. "Let me get this straight," Caleb said slowly. "You want me to help you take back your entire empire using pry bars, duct tape, and brute force electrical surges to bypass the most advanced DRM in the known universe. I am offering you a partnership," Serafina said, extending her hand. "Help me awaken the Ghost Fleet. Help me overthrow the Dominion and the Syndicate. In return, you will be named Grand Architect of the Ascendancy, and I will grant you a planetary system of your choosing, along with enough wealth to buy your human corporations 1,000 times over." Caleb looked at the delicate alien hand offered to him. He thought of the scrapyard. He thought of SpaceX debt collectors and the miserable, grinding poverty of the Outer Rim. He looked at the heavy wrench resting on his console. A slow, wolfish grin spread across Caleb's grease-stained face. He reached out and shook the princess's hand. "Princess," Caleb said, his eyes gleaming with the promise of absolute analog chaos, "we're going to need a lot more duct tape." What an epic ride. Caleb and Serafina proved that when flawless alien tech fails, human grit, duct tape, and a well-placed crowbar can take down an empire. Will they successfully hotwire the Ghost Fleet and reclaim the galaxy? If you loved this HFY sci-fi adventure and want to see more thrilling stories where human engineering saves the day, hit that like button. Don't forget to share this with your friends and subscribe to our channel for more amazing sci-fi tales.